Welcome to KU Padashala. In this lecture, I will be talking about Indian poetry in English before independence. As you all know, writing in English began to appear in India as a result of the colonial invasion. The introduction of English language and English education in India happened in the early part of 19th century. As a result, educational institutions, schools and universities began to appear in different parts of India. English education created a spirit for knowledge, a spirit of inquiry, and a kind of affinity for the Western philosophy, Western literature, and Western culture, and even Western religion among the English educated Indians. So the introduction of literature written in English in India is the result of the kind of widespread education in English medium that began to appear with the introduction of three important universities in Bombay, in Calcutta, and in Madras. So when we speak about Indian poetry in English, we find that we will have to begin from the introduction of English in India. In the 18th century, when English was introduced, Indian literature was dominated by the Sanskrit literature and the literatures produced in regional languages. It is a fact that literatures produced in regional languages were mostly translations from Sanskrit, and some of these books are not clear translations. They are to a certain extent transcreations of the Sanskrit original. So majority of these texts are adaptations or translations from Sanskrit or Mahabharata. In Malayalam itself, we find Tunjat Ramanujan Ezhuthachan's translations of Ramayana and Mahabharata, and we find that so the literature was dominated by the religious texts or religious stories or poems, plays based on the early epics and the religious texts. And it is in this context, or it is to this particular literary context, that English was introduced. When English was introduced, the early young scholars who learned English began to be drawn towards English literature. We know that the early poets were all influenced by the romantic poets, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and Byron. And the influence of romanticism is very much evident in their poetry. Though they were influenced by romanticism and the romantic tradition of writing in simple, straightforward language, writing small poems which are lyrical in nature, we find that it was a kind of a sweeping change in the tradition of writing, especially poetry writing in India, because the kind of practice in regional languages as well as in Sanskrit was that of very long poems, epic poems, khandakavyas. So these long poems or writing long poems was considered to be a sign of greatness of a poet. But with the familiarity with the British or the Western style of writing, We find that in India also poets began to write lyrical poems, small poems, using simple words that is easy to understand, writing about ordinary experiences of life. So in early Indian poetry in English, we come across such small, lyrical, beautiful poems that deals with ordinary experiences of life. For example, in Toruduth, you find Toruduth writing about an ordinary tree, a casuarina tree that remains in front of her ancestral home in Calcutta. So writing about a tree, writing a poem about a tree may be very ordinary in the contemporary period, but at that time it was not so ordinary. It was totally different from the poetic tradition that was prevalent at that time. So when we speak about creative writing in English by Indians, we will have to think about the context in which it appeared. It originated out of a kind of desire for learning the Western language, Western culture, and familiarizing with the Western tradition, not only literary tradition, but also the philosophical tradition and even the political tradition. We know that Indian nationalism began to emerge as a result of this familiarity with the European traditions, especially the French Revolution, the Renaissance, and the ideals of equality, fraternity, and democracy. So the language, introduction of English language in India created widespread transformation in the society. It is not just about learning a new language, writing in a new language, but it was about the transformation of the whole society into a modern kind of society, different from the kind of superstitious traditional Indian society, which believed in several age-old practices that are quite contrary to the modern democratic principles and the kind of ideals like equality and fraternity, etc. So this is certainly the background of the emergence of Indian poetry in English, or in general Indian writing in English, and we find that we will have to think about all these factors before going on to the poems. When we think about the early poets, we will have to remember at least some of them, and one poet who began to write in English in India is Henry Louis Vivian Derosio, who had a very short life. He was a lecturer in the Hindu college and was a firebrand, a kind of a revolutionary. He tried to propagate the idea of Western kind of rationalism. He was against all kinds of superstitions. He tried to influence the students and propagate his ideals. He was very much against the kind of worship of God. He was a kind of an atheist and tried to write about contemporary Indian experience. And because of this kind of revolutionary approach, Henry Louis Vivian Derosio was expelled from the college. He was expelled on the ground that he tried to create bad influence, evil influence among students. And he Derosio tried to write in a language that is very much modern, and at the same time he selected topics that are very much Indian. So he was writing in English but writing about India. And another important aspect of his writing was that he had a nationalistic approach throughout his writing. But at the same time, critics are of the view that Derosio is not a poet of great talent, or his technique is not so great. But even then, we find that, considering the fact that he was a pioneer in this field, writing poetry in English, Indian writing poetry in English, we can see that Derosio actually gave a beginning to the Indian poetry in English. His was the beginning. And after Derosio, there comes a group of poets, and most of them, or at least some of them, belongs to the Dutt family. We find a lot of poets who belongs to this family: Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Thoru Dutt, and many other Dutts. So we find that they are actually emblematic of a generation. The members of the Dutt family show certain common features, and these features are not limited to them. Majority of the English educated Indians shared most of these characteristics. One is that they are all having a kind of mad love for the West, that is, love for the Western culture, Western language, Western religion, mostly the English language and Christianity. And this mad love for the West prompted them to learn the Western languages. For example, Thoru Dutt learned French, she learned English, and she started translating French poems into English, and also started writing poems in English. She also wrote a novel in English. So we find that this mad love for the West prompted them even to migrate to Europe and to embrace Christianity. Thoru Dutt went to France and then to Italy, stayed there for some time, then went to England, stayed there for some time, and then came back to India. So this kind of desire to learn English was widespread among youngsters at that time. This is not only because of their love for the West and its culture and its ideas, but also because there was immense possibilities. There were immense possibilities of getting jobs, getting placements in civil service and in other fields during that time, if you possess a knowledge of English. So the desire to learn English was triggered by these factors. One is that they were attracted by the tradition and culture and language of the West. Another is that the possibilities of getting employment, very good employments in the civil service and in other fields. So it is clear that people who started learning English, they also started writing in English. We know that in India, in the beginning, it was prose writing that emerged in English. Raja Ram Mohan Roy is one of the earliest writers of prose in English. And it is after that, or at least at the same time, we find the emergence of poetry also. When we think about prose, we find that in India, prose as such did not exist at that time. Prose writing was not very common, or prose writing was not actually a practice in India. Prose was used for several official purposes and for writing documents related to various official purposes, but as a creative writing, prose was not used. So the introduction of prose in India certainly comes after the introduction of English, after the Indians were exposed to English. It is also true that English began to be used by Indians even before the official introduction of English education in India, because people belonging to the upper strata of the society, they try to learn English, they try to master in English, and they even send their children to England for education. That happened even before the official introduction of English education in India. So the introduction of prose, then the introduction of poetry, and I told you about Toru Dutt's. Along with Toru Dutt, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, all these poets also began to appear. In the case of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, there is a speciality. One is that he started writing in English, but after some time he decided to switch over to Bengali, and he started writing in Bengali. One of his most famous poems was in Bengali, Meghnad's Vat Kavya. And after that, after some time, we come across the emergence of writers like Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, etc. So Derosio began the tradition of writing in English, and the Fakir of Jangira is one of the collections of Derosio. Poems was another collection, and Toru Dutt actually began to stabilize Indian poetry in English, because it is with Toru Dutt that we come across the real kind of Indian poetry in English, because she tried to assimilate the techniques of British poetry into the Indian poetry in English. And even though she lived only for a very short period, in Toru Dutt's poetry we find the real kind of Indianness, a kind of Indianness, and an effort to reinterpret our tradition and our life, our experiences looking from a modern perspective. Michael Madhusudan Dutt wrote a poem, The Captive Lady, and published it in 1849. It was a kind of a metrical romance, and it describes the love adventures of Prithviraj Chauhan. So it is actually modeled on the romances, metrical romances that are available in English. But we find that Madhusudan Dutt was not happy with his performance in English, and that is why he switched over to Bengali. And his Bengali poem, that is Meghnad Vat Kavya, is hailed as one of the best poems, not only because of its poetic quality, but also because of the fact that it glorifies Meghnad, who is the son of Ravana. In our tradition, we know that Rama is considered to be the hero. Rama and Lakshmana were considered to be the hero. But in this poem, Madhusudan Dutt is projecting Ravana and Meghnad as heroes. By projecting Ravana and Meghnad, uh, Ashish Nandi argues that he is trying to project the masculine tradition that is prevalent in India. When he speaks about the masculine tradition, Ashish Nandi is actually trying to argue that colonialism, British colonialism, introduced a kind of masculinity into Indian culture. According to him, Indian tradition and Indian culture was dominantly feminine because it is dominated by the Brahmins and their ideologies. It is dominantly feminine. It is not led by the warrior class or the Kshatriyas, but instead it was led by the Brahmins, and they were dominantly feminine in nature. It is to this dominantly feminine Indian culture that the dominantly masculine Western culture appeared, and this masculinity created certain kinds of reactions in our culture and practices itself. Meghnad Vad Kavya is an example of this reaction. And how this happens? According to him, Michael Madhusudan Dutt is trying to search for the masculine traditions that are present in our culture. And that masculine tradition he finds in Ravana and Meghnad. And Ashish Nandi also refers to certain movements, political movements that are violent. The violent political movements and the kind of practices that are connected with Indian independence movement, the first rebellion, 1857, etc. All these are examples of the kind of filtering of masculinity into the Indian culture. Even Vivekananda, who is a sannyasi, speaks about the importance of the body. He speaks about playing football, protecting the body, because he is also influenced by the kind of masculine Western tradition. So the argument goes on like this. So we find that when we look at the Indian poetry in English in the early part, we find that we will have to discuss a number of ideas that are connected with the transformation created by the English language in India. And so when we come to Sarojini Naidu and the later poets in the pre-independence Indian poetry, Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, we find that there is the influence of nationalism, the national struggle for freedom, and this influence is very predominant, very evident in their poetry. Sarojini Naidu began to write poetry at an early age. She was sent to England for study at the age of 16, and there she started writing poetry, and these poems were all about England, the English landscape. So her professors, Edmund Gosse and many others, advised her to write about India. And so following this advice, she started writing about India, Indian landscape, Indian life, Indian village life, Indian folk tales and Indian tradition, about Radha and Krishna, and about Indian national struggle, etc. So Sarojini Naidu as a poet wrote about different aspects of Indian tradition, Indian culture and contemporary experiences like nationalism. Her poems about Radha and Krishna were considered to be love poems, and they were a kind of reinterpretation or reinterpretations of the Indian traditional mythical stories. And her poem Awake is a very good example of a nationalist poem of that time, because in Awake she considers India as a mother and all Indians as her children, and she specifically refers to Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Parsis, Sikhs, all the different religious groups in India, and says that they are all the children of the mother and they will all support the mother. So the concept of Mother India and all Indians, irrespective of their religious affiliation, as the children of the mother, is certainly one of the images, one of the concepts that were repeatedly produced by the nationalist writers and nationalist poets. So Sarojini Naidu is considered to be the nightingale of India, maybe because her poems were very, very melodious, very much influenced by the romantic poets. They were full of sensual images, very colorful poems, very musical, highly musical poems. And then after Sarojini Naidu, we come across Rabindranath Tagore, who is again one of the most important poets that India have ever produced, because he is the only Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Prize winning Indian poet, and he received the Nobel Prize in 1913 for his famous poem Gitanjali. Rabindranath Tagore is totally different from Sarojini Naidu and Thoru Dutt and Michael Madhusudan Dutt, etc. Even though he is also coming from Bengal, we find that his poetry is very much influenced by the tradition of the Brahma Samaj. The Brahma Samaj tradition of considering all living beings in this world as equal, that is, following the Vedic philosophy, the Vedic ideal of equality, or the oneness of all living beings, not only human beings, all living beings in this world. That is evident in Tagore's poetry. I think Tagore is a poet who has been heavily mistaken. He is considered to be a mystic poet by some, a spiritual poet by certain others, but Tagore is not a poet of spirituality or mysticism. It is true that he speaks about God, but for him God is only a divine force, a divine power which is present in everything, everywhere, which is behind everything in this world. He was very much against the kind of worship, the kind of superstitious practices in the name of religion. He doesn't follow any particular religion. So when we look at Gitanjali, even Gitanjali itself is a very good example of, or it is a kind of an expression of his philosophy. It is true that he has imbibed the best in the East and the best in the West. So his philosophy, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy's philosophy, is a combination of the Western and the Eastern traditions. He doesn't belong exclusively to the East or exclusively to the West. So in Gitanjali, he specifically argues that it is useless to go and worship in a dark chamber, whether it is in a temple or in any other place, or doing tapasya in a dark cave, a lonely cave where there are no people. But on the other hand, he says God is there where the tiller is tilling the ground. He is there with the ordinary workers, where the ordinary people are toiling hard. So according to him, God or the divine power is within human beings. Divinity means, or the love for the divine means the love for the people, the love for the living beings in this world. You can serve God by serving them, and that is his idea. It is a very modern concept of divinity, which he connects with the Vedic concept of the power of God, the divinity that is present everywhere, in everything, without any kind of segregation or division or discrimination. So he is actually against all kinds of discriminations on the basis of caste, on the basis of color, on the basis of class, etc. So after Tagore, we can discuss Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo is well known as a yogi, as a sannyasi, but he began not as a sannyasi, as a political activist, and he was imprisoned in Alipur Central Jail. It was during that time that he got a vision, and after his release, he went to Pondicherry and became a sannyasi and established an ashram, Aurobindo Ashram at Pondicherry. But in the initial stages, as a child, he was taken to England and educated in England. His father wanted him to learn only English. He never wanted him to learn Indian languages, and that is why his education was completely in England. But when he reached India, he started learning Indian languages. He became actively involved in the independence struggle and had all these troubles. But when we look at his poems, Aurobindo's poetry is considered to be a kind of metaphysical poetry, that is above physical. It is considered to be overhead poetry. So these are some of the terms that are used to refer to Aurobindo's poetry. It is considered to be overhead poetry, it is considered to be mystical poetry, it is considered to be metaphysical poetry. And these terms are used because he often writes about the experiences that are above physical, that is, the experiences of man's soul traveling up and up to reach the oversoul, the divine soul. Thought, the Paraclete, is a poem that speaks about this experience. Man's thoughts traveling through space to reach the oversoul and the different experiences of that. So his poetry is metaphysical in its sense, but at the same time we find that there is a commonness in all these poems, or in the poetry written by Rabindranath Tagore, Sarojini Naidu and Sri Aurobindo and many others. Even though they are all different, their style is different, the way of presentation is different, the themes are different, but still we can find a commonness. Look at Savitri, the epic poem written by Sri Aurobindo. Savitri is written modeled on the Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost. In Savitri, he deals with the story of Satyavan and Savitri. You are all familiar with the story of Satyavan and Savitri. Satyavan was taken away by Yama. Yama took away Satyavan, and Savitri, Satyavan's wife, went after them because she wanted to bring Satyavan back to the earth. And finally she succeeds in that. So this story is highly allegorical. Here, the fight of Savitri is against death, against disease, and she is finally she is attempting to liberate Satyavan from the clutches of death. So there is an idea of liberation, independence, and the vision of a life without death, a vision of a life that is liberated from death. So we can say that it is speaking about the ultimate liberation of man, spiritual liberation. At the same time, it is also signifying allegorical signification of the liberation of India, liberation of the nation is also, I think, there in this story. We can read it in that story. So even though Tagore, Aurobindo and Sarojini Naidu write in totally different styles, we find that there is a commonness among them. This commonness might have emerged out of the context, the social and political context of India at that time, because the independence struggle was going on. People were involved in different types of movements against the colonial power. So writing in that context, these poets could not escape the influence of those movements. And when we conclude this session on Indian poetry in English in the pre-independence period, we find that there is certainly a kind of imitation of the Western poetry, especially English poetry. Some of these poets imitated Byron, a poet like Aurobindo imitated Milton. But even then, we find that even in this imitation, there is a kind of deviation also. It is not a blind imitation. It is true that they are influenced by the Western writers, but at the same time, they deviated from that tradition and attempted to generate a new tradition of writing. And that is why when W.B. Yeats at first listened to Tagore's poetry, it is said that tears came in his eyes. He was very much influenced by Tagore's poetry, and he wrote the introduction to Gitanjali. Tagore's Gitanjali was translated into English on his journey to England. And after reaching England, he attended a reading session where he read Gitanjali songs. And in that, among the audience, there were important poets like W.B. Yeats and many others. W.B. Yeats was so much influenced by this poem, that is Gitanjali, that he advised Tagore to publish it. And he wrote an introduction to Gitanjali. And in that introduction, he speaks about his experience of reading Gitanjali. He says, while in the train or in the tram, he has to cover his face because tears was coming out of his eyes reading Gitanjali. Such was the strong influence of Gitanjali upon him. So that shows that Tagore's poetry was original in nature. It is lyrical. He was influenced by the lyrical tradition of the West, but he was able to create a kind of original poetry different from the Western poetry. So there is imitation and at the same time deviation from that tradition. And that is why Indian poetry in English in the pre-independence period can be valued, can be considered as a proper foundation for the development of Indian literature in English in the later periods. Thank you very much for listening.